was the kind of night where the fog crept in thick, as if the world outside had been swallowed whole. The small village of St. Mary Mead, usually so peaceful, was cloaked in an unnatural stillness, the type of quiet that seemed to press against your chest, urging you to hold your breath. From her modest home, Miss Marple looked out of her window at the swirls of mist curling around the street lamps. There was something afoot in the village tonight, something unsettling, a sense of anticipation thick in the air. The phone call came just after midnight. It was the local constable, a young man named George Parker, who had called her on occasion in the past. He was well aware of Miss Marple's reputation, though she rarely involved herself in such matters unless absolutely necessary. But tonight, her instincts were sharp, and the urgency in his voice piqued her curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, I need your help. It's Lady Evelyn. She's gone, and there's blood. Everywhere." Lady Evelyn, the Countess of Cheltenham, was a regular at the village's social gatherings. Her estate, a sprawling manor on the outskirts, had long been a symbol of wealth and mystery. Though she was known for her charitable work and friendly demeanour, there had always been whispers, tales of a young, passionate woman, of a love lost long ago, and of a fortune that no one seemed to fully understand. Her reputation had always hovered on the edge of fascination, and tonight the fog seemed to reflect that ambiguity. Miss Marple, though old, had a way of seeing through the veil of illusion that often clouded the minds of others. She had seen many things in her time, and there was something about this particular case that felt different. When she arrived at the Countess's manor, the house was eerily quiet. The grandeur of the estate seemed to mock the grim scene unfolding within. The constable led her through the large, imposing front door and into the grand hallway. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, masking the underlying tension. They walked quickly through the house, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. It was in the study where the mystery had unfurled. The large oak desk sat at the centre of the room, its surface gleaming under the light of a chandelier overhead. But it was the chair behind the desk that caught Miss Marple's attention. Lady Evelyn had been found slumped in the chair, a knife lodged deep in her chest. Her face, usually so composed, was frozen in a grimace of confusion and surprise. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no indication of forced entry. Just the blood, pooling slowly around her, staining the rug beneath her feet. But it wasn't the body that intrigued Miss Marple the most. It was the letter. An envelope lay on the desk, half open, as if the Countess had been interrupted in the middle of reading it. The letter itself was unusual. The handwriting was elegant, a cursive style that Miss Marple knew belonged to only one person, Lady Evelyn herself. But there was a peculiar detail, a strange mark in the corner of the envelope, a symbol that looked like nothing Miss Marple had ever seen before, a crescent moon with a small star embedded in its curve. "Do you recognize it, Miss Marple?" Constable Parker asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "Do you think it means something?" Miss Marple studied the letter carefully. There was no clue in the words themselves, no direct message from the killer. But the symbol, odd, unexplained, was like a riddle waiting to be solved. There was also the matter of the knife. It wasn't just any weapon, but a ceremonial blade, likely belonging to someone with a taste for the theatrical. "It's peculiar," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. This crime, at first glance, it seems so simple. Yet the clues seem designed to lead us in every direction but the right one. The constable nodded but remained silent, as if he feared to voice the doubt settling in his mind. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the mystery pressing in on them both. "What about the other staff?" Miss Marple asked, breaking the stillness. "Has anyone been questioned?" "We've spoken to them all, Constable," Parker replied, but no one heard anything. The servants were all in their quarters, and none of the family or guests were around. No one saw a thing. "Have you spoken to the Countess's son?" Miss Marple inquired, though she already knew the answer. "No, ma'am," Parker replied, a slight shake to his voice. "That's the odd part. Lord Philip wasn't at the manor. He's been away on business for the past few days. The only ones in the house at the time were the staff." Miss Marple took one last look at the body, her mind turning over the details with methodical precision. The crime was too neat, too perfect, and yet too baffling. She could almost hear the clock ticking, each second a beat in the rhythm of the puzzle. There were too many elements that didn't fit together, elements that seemed deliberate, a puzzle made with intention but lacking the obvious piece that tied everything together. But then her eyes fell again on the symbol. The crescent moon with the star. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of the desk, her thoughts weaving through the years of life experience that had taught her to read between the lines. It was then she realized what was missing. The one person who might have known the Countess's secrets better than anyone else. "I believe I have an idea," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "But we must make one more stop before we draw any conclusions." The constable's eyebrows furrowed. "Where, ma'am?" "To the library, I think. I suspect Lady Evelyn was trying to leave us a message. It wasn't the killer who wanted us to find the letter. It was the Countess herself." Parker blinked in surprise. "But why?" "Because," Miss Marple said, turning to leave, "she wasn't just a victim. She was trying to expose something, a secret that had been hidden for far too long." The library was a vast room, a sea of mahogany shelves crammed with leather-bound books, their spines gleaming under the dim, flickering light of the chandelier above. Miss Marple had known this place well, having attended several gatherings in the past, and though the air was thick with the weight of grief, there was something comforting about the familiarity of the space. The smell of aged paper and the faint scent of wood polish mixed with the tension that seemed to hang in the air. She walked slowly, her gaze scanning every corner of the room with deliberate precision. The constable followed closely behind, his footsteps much heavier than hers. He wasn't sure what to expect after all. What could a library possibly tell them that the study hadn't already? But Miss Marple's instinct was never wrong. At first the room appeared untouched, just as it should be given the circumstances. But Miss Marple's keen eye saw something others might have missed. Near the far wall, beside the fireplace, a chair sat slightly askew. It wasn't much, but it struck her as odd. The chair's position was slightly off-center, as if someone had risen in haste or was interrupted mid-conversation. But that wasn't what caught her attention. No, it was the book, sitting open on the arm of the chair, its pages half-turned. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the page, brushing it carefully. The book was a historical novel, one of those old romantic tales of knights and ladies. But the passage it had opened to was oddly appropriate. The words on the page spoke of betrayal, a lover's betrayal no less. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if it was intentional. Was this a clue Lady Evelyn had left behind, or merely a coincidence? Her mind spun briefly, but she continued her search. As she moved toward the desk in the corner of the room, her gaze drifted toward the small, ornately framed mirror above it. She stopped. There was something peculiar about its reflection. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The mirror had an unusually heavy layer of dust in places where it shouldn't have been. On the corners, the edges, and particularly along the frame, where fingers had likely touched it recently. Miss Marple's fingers delicately traced the dust, noting the smoothness of the surface around the frame, as if someone had been standing before it, their hands nervously brushing against the wood. "You found something, haven't you?" Constable Parker asked quietly, his voice almost reverential. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she bent closer, examining the reflection in the mirror with a thoughtful frown. There was a strange disturbance in the surface, as if something had been placed in front of it, blocking its natural shine. Slowly she leaned in further, her eyes scanning the edges. There, a faint indentation in the dust, almost as if something had been moved recently, then hastily replaced. She straightened up, her mind piecing together the puzzle. "I believe Lady Evelyn was trying to tell us something. Perhaps this mirror was an obstacle, something hidden in plain sight. Or perhaps it was a clue, something in the reflection that's not what it seems." She heard Parker's confused sigh behind her, but he didn't interrupt. He trusted Miss Marple's instincts, even when they defied all conventional logic. Miss Marple continued her investigation, her hands now gliding over the desk, brushing aside some papers, her movements almost mechanical. The surface was clean, organized, a stark contrast to the disarray of the study. But as her fingers grazed across the neat piles, she found another anomaly. A small, leather-bound notebook was tucked away beneath a stack of official-looking papers. It was hidden well enough that no one else had noticed it, yet it was clearly placed with some care. Miss Marple took it carefully in her hands, her curiosity piqued. The pages inside were filled with neat, precise handwriting, but the entries were cryptic. Dates, names, locations. But beneath these, a list of expenses caught her eye. Strange amounts of money, all directed to the same name, Anton St. Clair. Miss Marple's heart skipped. St. Clair was a name she knew well. A businessman with a shadowed reputation, always involved in dealings that skirted the edge of legality. The last time Miss Marple had heard of him, it was in a conversation between Lady Evelyn and a few of her friends. Nothing too obvious, just a passing mention, but there had always been an air of suspicion around him. It was clear now. Lady Evelyn had been involved with him in some capacity, financially at least. The expenses seemed too deliberate to ignore. "Miss Marple." Constable Parker's voice was hesitant, but his words jolted her back to the present. She looked up, her face unreadable. "Parker," she said softly, "I think it's time we pay Mr. St. Clair a visit." But as they turned to leave, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. Both turned toward the door, only to see a tall figure standing in the doorway, Lord Philip, the Countess's son. His eyes were wide, his face flushed with an emotion Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice tight with panic. "Where's my mother?" "Lord Philip," Parker began, his voice neutral but laced with an edge of suspicion. "I'm afraid your mother is dead. We found her in the study." Philip's face crumpled in grief, but Miss Marple was keenly aware of something else. His hesitation, the slight quiver of his hand as he reached for the doorframe. It was subtle, but it was there. A crack in his facade. Dead. His voice was hoarse, but there was something almost rehearsed in the way the words came out, as though he had prepared for this moment. But his surprise at hearing it aloud was genuine. Miss Marple, her gaze sharp, studied him closely. His grief seemed too sudden, too overwhelming, almost as if it had been triggered by hearing the words rather than the news itself. Could it be that he had already known? Could it be that Lord Philip had not only been aware of his mother's death but had orchestrated it? As if reading her mind, Constable Parker moved to speak, but Miss Marple held up a hand. She could feel it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The pieces were starting to fall into place, though the picture was still unclear. One thing was certain, though. Lord Philip was hiding something. "Lord Philip," Miss Marple said, her voice cool and steady. "Perhaps we should have a little chat about Anton St. Clair." The room fell silent as Lord Philip's eyes flicked from Miss Marple to the constable, then back again. His lips pressed tightly together as if holding back more than just grief. He had the look of a man caught between his emotions and the need for control. But Miss Marple could see the shift in his demeanour, the nervous tension in his posture, the faint tremble in his hands that couldn't quite be hidden. I don't understand," he said, his voice still quivering, though he made a valiant attempt to steady it. "What does Anton St. Clair have to do with this?" Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "It's an unfortunate fact, Lord Philip, that your mother's finances seem to have been tied to Mr. St. Clair. I think it's time you explain that connection." For a long moment, Lord Philip seemed to debate whether to speak. His lips pressed together, and his eyes darted to the door, as if considering an escape. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he gave in. "My mother," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "was a generous woman. She was too generous sometimes. St. Clair was a businessman, yes, but she believed in helping him, believing in his causes. I don't know what exactly they were, but I know she was trying to fix something. She'd been doing it for years, and I always told her to stay away from him." His words came in a rush, and Miss Marple caught the subtle undercurrent in them. The note of defensiveness was unmistakable. But he wasn't telling the whole truth. She could see it in the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "Generosity, yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but why the secrecy? Why hide these transactions in a private ledger?" Lord Philip shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering away. "She didn't want me to know," he muttered, as though ashamed of it. "She believed I would stop her. But it wasn't anything criminal. It was, well, complicated." He paused, then added quickly, "She didn't want me to worry." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, noting the way he swallowed hard, the slight twitch in his hands. There was a story he wasn't telling, one that involved more than just financial transactions. Perhaps it wasn't the money that was complicating matters. "I see," she said slowly. "And what was the nature of your relationship with Mr. St. Clair?" Lord Philip looked at her, then back at the ground, his voice low. "I never liked him." "But Mother, she always believed in him. She'd make excuses for him. I tried to warn her, but there was no reasoning with her." There it was, the small contradiction. If he disliked St. Clair so much, why did he never take stronger action to keep him away from his mother? Why allow him to manipulate her? The answer was sitting just beneath the surface, but Miss Marple knew that probing too aggressively might make him shut down. Instead, she pressed gently. "You mentioned your mother was trying to fix something," Miss Marple said. "What did she mean by that?" Lord Philip hesitated, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple thought he might avoid the question altogether. But then he sighed heavily, as though resigned to the fact that he couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. "She thought St. Clair was in trouble," he said quietly. "She was convinced he was being blackmailed, that something terrible was going to happen to him. She believed in him despite everything. She thought she could save him." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Miss Marple felt the weight of them settle over her, her mind turning over the implications. Blackmail? Was it possible that St. Clair wasn't the only one with something to hide? Perhaps Lady Evelyn had been trying to shield him from something or someone. "And where were you last night, Lord Philip?" Constable Parker asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "When your mother was killed?" Lord Philip's face stiffened, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "I told you, I've been away. On business. I arrived back today." "Did you speak to anyone on your way back? Anyone who could confirm your whereabouts?" "No," he replied quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. I don't believe so." Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in his tone. He hadn't said no one, just that he didn't believe so. That was an important distinction, one she filed away for later. His answer had come too fast, too sharp. She nodded, but before she could say anything else, the door to the library creaked open and a figure stepped inside. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Waverley, her face pale with worry. She held a tray of tea, her hands trembling slightly, as she placed it on the desk. "Is there anything else I can do, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice almost pleading. Miss Marple turned to her, studying her carefully. Mrs. Waverley had been with the family for years, and while her loyalty was unquestionable, there was something about her presence now that seemed off. She stood a little too stiffly, as though waiting for something, perhaps an opportunity to speak or to avoid it. "Tell me, Mrs. Waverley," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but direct. "What can you tell me about last night? Did you see anything unusual?" The housekeeper's eyes flickered toward Lord Philip, and Miss Marple caught the faintest glimpse of something. Fear, maybe, or guilt. It was gone in an instant, but Miss Marple knew it had been there. She had only to wait a moment longer before Mrs. Waverley's voice broke the silence. I don't know much, Miss Marple," she said, her hands tightening around the tray. "I was in my quarters when I heard noises late into the night, but I didn't go out. I didn't want to disturb anyone." "Noises?" Miss Marple asked. "What kind of noises?" The housekeeper's eyes flickered again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Arguing, I think, voices raised, but I couldn't say who." "Could it have been Lord Philip?" Miss Marple pressed, her gaze sharp. Mrs. Waverley's eyes darted back to Lord Philip, and Miss Marple caught the briefest flash of hesitation before she shook her head, almost too quickly. I don't know," she murmured. "I couldn't say." Miss Marple felt the air shift, and she caught the subtle signs. The evasive glances, the small contradictions, the housekeeper's unwillingness to name names. Something wasn't right with her story either. "Thank you, Mrs. Waverley," Miss Marple said, her tone polite but insistent. "I think we will have more questions for you later." As the housekeeper departed, Miss Marple turned back to Lord Philip, her mind working quickly. There were threads here, thin and fragile, but they were there. Small inconsistencies, moments of hesitation. Something didn't add up. Lord Philip's defence of his mother seemed genuine at first, but his emotions were too controlled, too rehearsed. And Mrs. Waverley, her fears, her contradictions, were just as telling. There were secrets being kept, and Miss Marple had a growing suspicion that more than one person in this house knew far more than they were letting on. The room felt colder now, the weight of unspoken truths settling between them. And as Miss Marple prepared to delve deeper, she knew the answers would come soon. But the question remained: who was lying, and what were they hiding? As Miss Marple sat back in the creaky wooden chair, her fingers steepled together thoughtfully, the pieces of the puzzle swirled in her mind like a storm that refused to settle. Each suspect, the son, the housekeeper, the businessman, seemed to have a motive. Yet none of them offered a complete answer to the question of who killed Lady Evelyn and why. It wasn't a simple case of greed or passion. There were deeper currents beneath the surface, a tangled web of relationships, secrets, and emotions. Lord Philip's defensiveness had given her much to think about. His insistence that he had been away on business and had no connection to his mother's death seemed too rehearsed. Could he have killed her to stop her from revealing a truth he wasn't ready to face? Or was he simply hiding something far more complex, something that involved his own weakness and shame? He had certainly not looked surprised when he'd been told of his mother's death, though his grief had seemed genuine. Perhaps it was the grief of a man who had already braced for it, or worse, someone who didn't care enough to hide his relief. Then there was Mrs. Waverley. Her reluctance to talk, her hesitation when asked direct questions, it all spoke of secrets. What exactly had she heard in the night? Why had she been so eager to avoid implicating Lord Philip? Perhaps she knew something about him, about his relationship with his mother, or his involvement with St. Clair. But there were other possibilities. Mrs. Waverley's long service in the household made her both a loyal ally and a potential witness to things no one else had seen. Was it loyalty to Lady Evelyn that had kept her silent, or loyalty to someone else? And Anton St. Clair, the businessman with a reputation as dark as the city alleys he frequented. Was it just a coincidence that Lady Evelyn had been financially involved with him? She had been a woman of great wealth and influence, yes, but why would she lend her support to a man whose dealings were so murky? Miss Marple had yet to meet him, but his name kept surfacing in the strangest of places, and she couldn't help but wonder whether he had more to gain from Lady Evelyn's death than anyone had realized. Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the ledger she'd found in Lady Evelyn's study. It had been tucked away with care, and the transactions had been suspiciously neat. She remembered the name, Anton St. Clair, repeated in the columns of numbers, the large sums of money directed toward him. Was it simply a matter of Lady Evelyn's generosity, or was there something darker at play? Had St. Clair been blackmailing her, or was he simply exploiting her, using her as a pawn in a much larger game? But none of these theories fully explained what had happened. All of them, taken together, painted a picture of a woman surrounded by hidden motives, each one of them plausible, but none of them comprehensive. Miss Marple could feel the puzzle pieces pressing against her mind, fighting for their place in the greater picture. She needed to start asking the right questions, and to do that, she needed to start with the one thing that had been overlooked: The missing letter. Lady Evelyn had been found with no obvious signs of struggle, and the room had been locked from the inside. Nothing had been taken, nothing except for the letter. Miss Marple remembered the fragment she had seen in the study, the torn edges of what had been a personal correspondence, the handwriting that had been familiar but too faint to read. What had been in that letter? And why had it been so important? Who had Lady Evelyn been writing to? Why had it been hidden? The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward, her mind weaving through the labyrinth of possibilities. The alibis of the suspects seemed solid, but so many things had not been said. Lord Philip's business trip had been confirmed, but had anyone really seen him during the hours of his mother's death? Mrs. Waverley's account of hearing voices late at night might have been true, but what had she been doing at that time? And then there was St. Clair, whose movements were even more difficult to pin down. It was then that a sudden thought struck her, a thought so simple it almost seemed foolish to ignore it earlier. The letter. Lady Evelyn had been working on something important, something that had weighed heavily on her mind in her final days. Had it been the letter that had pushed her to confront St. Clair, or worse, to make an irreversible decision? And had the contents of the letter been so significant that they led someone to take drastic action to keep them hidden? Miss Marple stood up abruptly, causing the constable to glance at her in surprise. Without another word, she motioned for him to follow as she made her way toward the study once more. The room still smelled faintly of the perfume Lady Evelyn had worn, and the scent of polished wood lingered in the air, but this time Miss Marple's focus was entirely on the desk. She sat at the desk once more, flipping through the papers with a practiced hand. The ledger with its neat columns of transactions lay beside her, but she ignored it for the moment. The torn pieces of paper that had once formed a letter were spread out in front of her, and her eyes narrowed as she inspected them carefully. The handwriting was elegant, distinct, but there was something about it, a certain delicacy to the strokes that suggested it wasn't just a casual letter. As she pieced the fragments together, she could see that the letter had been written just days before Lady Evelyn's death. There was mention of a meeting, a confrontation, and then, most disturbingly, a reference to a deal that had gone terribly wrong. The details were sparse, but the implication was clear. Lady Evelyn had uncovered something about St. Clair, something that he would go to great lengths to protect. Perhaps she had planned to confront him that night. Perhaps she had planned to end their association once and for all. But there was a second piece to the puzzle that was just as troubling. The handwriting itself. Miss Marple frowned as she carefully compared the handwriting in the letter to the notes she had found in the ledger, the neatly written entries that detailed the money directed to St. Clair. The penmanship was too similar, too refined to be a simple coincidence. Had Lady Evelyn been the one to write the letter, or had someone else written it on her behalf? The thought was chilling. Miss Marple set the pieces of the letter aside, her mind racing. If Lady Evelyn hadn't written the letter herself, then it was possible, just possible, that the letter had been forged. And if it had been forged, then it meant that the person who had written it was someone very close to her. Someone with enough access to her life and her finances to manipulate her actions. "Parker," Miss Marple said suddenly, her voice sharp, "I think we've been looking at this all wrong." The constable, who had been silently observing, straightened up, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "The letter," Miss Marple said. her voice low and deliberate. It wasn't just a letter. It was a key to something Lady Evelyn had uncovered. And I think we've been so focused on the obvious suspects that we've missed something far more subtle. The person who stands to gain the most from her death is not St. Clair, but someone else entirely. Parker blinked in confusion, but Miss Marple's mind was already moving toward the next step. The web was tightening. The threads were pulling together. Now all that was left was to follow them to the heart of the deception. The early morning, sunlight filtered through the high windows of the manor, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Constable Parker stood by the door, holding a fresh set of papers, his expression a mixture of excitement and relief. His hands trembled slightly as he approached Miss Marple, who was seated at the study desk, her mind still churning with fragments of information. She had thought she had uncovered something, some faint thread of truth. But this new development seemed to throw everything into disarray. "I think we've found something, Miss Marple," Parker said, his voice almost too eager. "It's the letter. The one Lady Evelyn had been hiding. We've traced the handwriting. It matches an old correspondence between Lady Evelyn and her solicitor. This letter, well, it seems to confirm everything. She was about to confront St. Clair over some illegal dealings. She knew something damning, and it's likely that he was desperate to silence her." Miss Marple listened, her face unreadable. The words felt too neat, too easily tied together. There was no doubt that the handwriting matched, and the contents of the letter painted a damning picture of Anton St. Clair, who had long been rumoured to have been involved in shady business practices. Yet Miss Marple's instincts told her that something wasn't quite right. "This is it," Parker continued, his voice growing more confident. "The motive is clear. St. Clair stands to gain the most. We've already confirmed his financial troubles, and now it's obvious. Lady Evelyn must have found out about his schemes. He had everything to lose and nothing to gain by letting her live." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She had been around long enough to see the eager rush to conclusions, the way a theory could feel like a victory too soon. Parker's excitement was palpable, and she could see the trap being set for him. "Are you sure, Constable?" she asked quietly, not looking up from the letter fragments that lay spread out before her. "Are you sure this is what it seems? It's very convenient, isn't it? Everything falls into place a little too easily." Parker looked at her, puzzled by her hesitation. "But Miss Marple, the handwriting matches, and the rest of the evidence points straight to St. Clair. It makes perfect sense." Miss Marple slowly leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Perhaps. But in my experience, the simplest solution is often the most dangerous. We have a suspect, but what does he really know? What does he have to hide? I don't know, Parker. This doesn't feel like the end of the case. It feels like the beginning of a deeper one." Parker's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, the door to the study opened. It was Lord Philip, his face taut with suppressed emotion, his eyes shadowed by something more than grief. He stepped inside, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of something else in his expression, something too guarded, too controlled to be genuine. "I've just heard the news," Lord Philip said, his voice tight. "Is it true? Have you found the letter? Do you have enough to accuse St. Clair?" Miss Marple studied him with a quiet intensity. There was a slight tremor in his hands, his posture a little too rigid. He wasn't just a man awaiting confirmation of his mother's death. He was a man whose nerves had been stretched thin, his emotions fraying at the edges. "The letter has been found," Miss Marple said carefully, "and its contents certainly point toward Mr. St. Clair, but there's something I'm not yet certain of. You see, the letter might be the key, but it could also be a very well-constructed diversion." Lord Philip's gaze darkened, and his voice took on an edge of impatience. "Miss Marple, we've been over this. There's no room for doubt. St. Clair has every reason to silence my mother. If we act now, we can ensure he's caught before he tries to flee." "And what if," Miss Marple interjected softly, "what if the real truth is not so simple? What if the letter was planted? What if it's meant to lead us down a false trail?" The room grew quiet at her words, and Parker's hopeful expression faltered for a moment. Lord Philip's face tightened, but he held his ground. "What are you suggesting? That we've been wrong? That St. Clair isn't the one responsible?" Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of the question to settle before responding. "I'm suggesting that the timing of this evidence is too perfect. Everything fits too neatly. It's as if someone wanted us to believe that St. Clair is the killer." Lord Philip's gaze flicked to the desk, to the torn letter fragments that Miss Marple had pieced together. "I don't see how that's possible. The handwriting matches. The letter confirms everything she was going to do. Confront him, end the business dealings. It's all there." "It is," Miss Marple agreed, "but sometimes the simplest explanation is a trap. Someone might have wanted to give us just enough to make us rush to judgment." Lord Philip's eyes widened. "You're saying we should ignore the evidence?" "I'm saying we need to look at the bigger picture," Miss Marple replied. "Lady Evelyn may have uncovered something, but what if it wasn't about St. Clair at all? What if someone else stood to gain far more from her death?" The room fell silent once again, and Parker, now looking more perplexed than ever, shuffled, his feet uncomfortably. But who else? Who would have wanted to kill Lady Evelyn? "That," Miss Marple said, her voice growing softer as she picked up a new fragment of the letter, "is what we need to figure out. The truth might be far more complicated than we think." Lord Philip's expression was unreadable now, his earlier impatience gone, replaced with something else, something darker. "Are you suggesting that my mother's death wasn't just about the money? That someone else, someone close to her, might have been involved?" "I'm suggesting we keep an open mind," Miss Marple replied, her gaze fixed on the fragment in her hand, "and we start asking the questions no one else has thought to ask." The conversation seemed to fade as Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. She turned the pieces of evidence over in her mind like cards, shuffling them, trying to make sense of the pattern they created. But nothing fit perfectly. Not yet. Something was still missing, an element that hadn't been revealed. As the minutes passed, Miss Marple began to see the cracks in the case they had built. The evidence was strong, but it wasn't foolproof. The handwriting on the letter, the circumstantial connections, it all pointed towards St. Clair. Yet something still didn't sit right. Someone had planted a clue that was far too obvious, too easy to find, and in that moment, Miss Marple knew. This wasn't the breakthrough they thought it was. It was a false victory, a victory designed to lead them in the wrong direction. The real criminal was still out there, waiting, watching, patiently for the moment when the net would close around them. The tension in the room had shifted, no longer dominated by the palpable relief that had followed the supposed breakthrough, but by something darker, more uncertain. The search for the truth had become far more elusive. The idea that the case was solved, that Anton St. Clair had somehow been caught, now seemed a distant fantasy. Miss Marple's instincts had proven correct. There was more to this than anyone had realized. The evidence before them, so convincing in its simplicity, was but a carefully constructed facade. Now a new, unsettling thought took root in her mind. She could feel it, like an itch at the back of her mind. The past. It was there, lurking just beyond the reach of their understanding. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair again, her eyes scanning the room, though her mind was miles away, tracing a long-forgotten thread of memory that had suddenly resurfaced. The atmosphere was charged, thick with unspoken questions, as Parker and Lord Philip waited for her next move. She ignored them for the moment, lost in the haze of recollection. "Miss Marple?" Parker's voice was tentative, pulling her from her reverie. "Is there something else?" She looked up at him, her expression calm, but the sharpness of her gaze made his pulse quicken. "The past," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's always there, isn't it, just waiting to resurface?" Lord Philip, still standing by the door, shifted uneasily. He had been listening carefully, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? We've gone over everything. The letter, the handwriting matches. St. Clair has a clear motive." "Does he?" Miss Marple said, her voice low and deliberate. "We've been looking for the connections in the wrong place, you see. This isn't just a matter of money or revenge. It's something much deeper." The constable's brow furrowed, and even Lord Philip seemed to hesitate, as if something in her tone made him uncomfortable. Miss Marple picked up a small piece of paper from the desk, an old letter she had found earlier, and ran her fingers over the surface, as if seeking something hidden in its folds. "Have you heard of the Willingham case?" Miss Marple asked suddenly. "The Willingham case," Parker echoed, his voice tinged with doubt. "That's from years ago. What does that have to do with this?" Miss Marple's eyes met his. "The Willingham case was a scandal back in the late 20s. A young woman, Eleanor Willingham, was murdered, strangled in her own home. No one ever figured out who did it. It was a mystery that puzzled the entire community. There were suspicions, but no concrete proof. The case was closed after a few months, and the details were largely forgotten. But I remember something about it, something important." Lord Philip's face had paled slightly at the mention of the case, though he quickly masked it with a controlled expression. "What connection does this have to my mother's death?" "That's what I intend to find out," Miss Marple said, her voice now sharper. She turned to the ledger again, where the name St. Clair was still prominent, appearing as a recurring entry among Lady Evelyn's financial dealings. The Willingham case was a different time, yes. But the people involved, the connections, some of them are right here, in this room. A cold silence descended. Lord Philip opened his mouth to speak, but Miss Marple raised a hand, halting him. She was already piecing together something he had not yet understood. "I can't explain it all yet," Miss Marple continued, "but I believe the answer to this case lies not just in the present, but in something that happened long ago. Something that has been buried, forgotten by most, but still alive in the shadows of those who were involved." Lord Philip looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. "I have no idea what you're talking about. My mother had no connection to any Willingham. That was decades ago." "I think you're mistaken," Miss Marple replied softly. "The connections may be hidden, but they're there. Eleanor Willingham was involved with your mother, and so was St. Clair. I wonder if it was more than just business. There's something about the two women, Lady Evelyn and Eleanor, that links them far more intimately than you realize." At that, Lord Philip's face tightened even further, his jaw set in a grim line. He looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something darker. But he remained silent, unwilling or unable to address the accusations. Parker, however, seemed genuinely perplexed, his brows knitting together as he processed her words. "Wait a moment," Parker said, a flicker of recognition in his voice. Are you suggesting that St. Clair knew both women? That he was involved with both of them?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. St. Clair was indeed involved with both Lady Evelyn and Eleanor Willingham, but in different ways. See, Eleanor Willingham was once engaged to St. Clair, but their engagement ended abruptly. Eleanor was found dead in her home just weeks after the breakup. No one could explain the suddenness of her death, but those who knew her suspected that she had been murdered, though the police could never prove it." Parker's eyes widened and Lord Philip stiffened. His lips pressed tight in a thin line. "That's a long time ago," Lord Philip said, almost defensively. "How could this be relevant now?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "the past has a way of resurfacing. Eleanor's death was never solved, and St. Clair, he never stopped associating with Lady Evelyn. It's all connected. Lady Evelyn must have known something about Eleanor's death that no one else did." A cold shiver ran through the room as the weight of her words sank in. Miss Marple's voice softened, but it was no less resolute. "The key is St. Clair. He was at the center of both women's lives, and he knew how to manipulate them. He had the motive to kill Eleanor, and he had the motive to kill Lady Evelyn. But why? What was it that connected them both in his eyes? That's the thread we need to follow." The revelation hung in the air like an unspoken truth that could no longer be ignored. Lord Philip's eyes darted nervously, and Parker looked from one to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden shift in the investigation. Miss Marple rose from her chair slowly, her movements deliberate. "I'm going to visit the Willingham estate tomorrow," she said. "Perhaps there's something there, something in Eleanor's old house, that will shed light on this tangled web. The connections may be buried, but they're not lost. Not yet. I don't understand," Parker said, his voice uncertain. "You think Eleanor's death is the key. How does that explain Lady Evelyn's murder?" "It explains everything," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Because the person who killed Lady Evelyn, he's not just a killer of the present. He's someone trying to erase the past." As she walked toward the door, her mind was already racing ahead, formulating the next steps. The connections were becoming clearer now. The answers lay hidden in the shadows of the past, buried in long-forgotten secrets, and she would not rest until she unearthed them. The Willingham estate, despite its age, still bore the marks of wealth and grace. Ivy clung to the stone walls like a shroud, and the gardens, though untended in places, still hinted at the beauty they once had. Miss Marple stood on the threshold of the old house, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. It wasn't just the physical decay of the estate that unsettled her. It was the sense of something hidden, buried in the walls, beneath the layers of time and neglect. She had arrived earlier than expected, wanting the estate to herself for a while before anyone else could arrive. The air was crisp, the trees swaying in the soft breeze. But the usual comforts of the English countryside couldn't erase the uneasy feeling gnawing at her. She was looking for something specific, something that would link Lady Evelyn's death to Eleanor Willingham's. She couldn't shake the feeling that the two cases were connected more deeply than anyone had realized. The letter, the handwriting, and the strange similarities in the patterns of behavior, it was all too neat. Inside, the house felt abandoned, but not in the way one might expect. There was an odd sense of activity lingering in the corners of each room, as though the house was waiting for something to happen. Miss Marple made her way to the library, where Eleanor Willingham had spent most of her time. The room was dark and dimly lit, save for a sliver of light coming through the drawn curtains. Books lined the walls in haphazard piles, and dust had settled thick on the furniture. Still, there was something that caught Miss Marple's eye, a small, unassuming trinket resting on the edge of a writing desk. It was a broken pendant, the delicate chain twisted in on itself. The pendant itself was a small, worn piece of metal, engraved with initials, E.W. The sight of it caused Miss Marple to pause, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the desk. A strange chill ran down her spine. The pendant was old, very old, certainly not something Eleanor would have worn recently. But it had been hers. She was sure of it. The clue, seemingly small and insignificant, was telling her something. A piece of Eleanor's past, left behind in a place that had been otherwise untouched for years. Her mind raced. This pendant had to mean something. It couldn't be a coincidence that it was found here, in the one place that might hold the key to everything. She turned the pendant over in her hand, examining it carefully. The initials were unmistakable. Eleanor Willingham had worn this. But why had it been left here, in a room that hadn't seen life in years? She carefully tucked the pendant into her coat pocket, resolving to come back to it later. But before she left the library, she scanned the room once more, something in the back of her mind urging her to take another look at the old desk. As her eyes moved across the cluttered surface, something stood out, an odd pile of papers, half hidden under a stack of letters. Miss Marple approached the desk slowly, then rifled through the papers, hoping to find something relevant, anything that might shed light on the mystery at hand. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she could feel the pieces starting to fit together in her mind. One document in particular caught her attention. It was an old ledger, yellowed with age, and yet the ink was still remarkably legible. As she scanned the entries, her heart skipped a beat. This ledger was filled with financial transactions, ones that seemed unrelated to Eleanor Willingham's personal affairs, but were strangely connected to the St. Clair family. The name Anton St. Clair appeared several times in the context of large sums of money being transferred. The dates were close to the time when Eleanor's engagement to St. Clair had ended, and close to the time of her death. It was too much of a coincidence for Miss Marple to ignore. She knew now that she wasn't just dealing with the murder of Lady Evelyn. She was dealing with something much larger, a network of deceit that stretched far beyond the confines of this one estate. She placed the ledger back where she found it, her mind whirling. The next step was clear. She needed to confront the suspects. But there was one more thing she needed to do before she moved forward. She needed to test them, to see how they would react when pushed, to see if the cracks in their facades would show. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the manor, her mind turning over the evidence. Lord Philip was waiting for her in the study, his face grim as always, but there was a subtle nervousness about him that she had not seen before. As she entered, he gave her a curt nod. "Have you found anything, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone slightly forced. I have, she replied softly, her voice betraying nothing of the triumph she felt at her discovery. I found something at the Willingham estate, something that might explain a lot. But first, I need to ask you a few questions. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Go ahead. Earlier, Miss Marple began, her gaze steady. You seemed so certain about Anton St. Clair. You said he had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. But when I mentioned Eleanor Willingham, you seemed uncomfortable. Lord Philip's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but it was enough for Miss Marple to see. He was hiding something, and she had just uncovered a crack in his carefully constructed facade. I don't know what you mean, he said, his voice too calm, too controlled. Did you know about the financial transactions between St. Clair and Eleanor Willingham? Miss Marple pressed, watching his face closely. The large sums of money being transferred just before her death. There was a brief pause. Lord Philip's jaw clenched, and Miss Marple saw his fingers tighten around the edge of his chair. He wasn't prepared for this. The subtle flicker of discomfort in his eyes was unmistakable. I don't know anything about that, he said, his voice sharp now, though the lie was thin. Eleanor's death was tragic, but it's irrelevant to this case. My mother's murder is what matters here. Miss Marple didn't miss the way his hands trembled ever so slightly, the way his gaze darted to the window as though he were searching for an escape. It's not irrelevant, Lord Philip, Miss Marple said quietly, her voice lowering. Everything is connected. You may not want to believe it, but the truth is right in front of you, and you're about to make a grave mistake if you keep pretending otherwise. His lips parted, but no words came out. He was caught. Something in his mind was scrambling for an explanation, but the truth was already slipping through the cracks. Lord Philip, Miss Marple continued, her voice steady and calm, you know more than you're letting on, and I believe you know exactly how St. Clair is connected to your mother's death. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering, her words precise and deliberate. Lord Philip was cornered, but he had not yet revealed the full extent of his involvement. She could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the hesitation. It was then that she realized he wasn't just trying to protect his family's reputation. No, there was something deeper at play here. Fear, regret, guilt, it all swirled in his expression, and she had only just begun to peel back the layers of deception. The evening settled over the Willingham estate, with a strange stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. Miss Marple sat in the study, her fingers lightly drumming on the edge of a desk, her mind racing through the tangled web of deception she had uncovered. Lord Philip's nervousness lingered in the air like a fog, but she knew better than to push him further. Not yet. She had found something critical earlier, but it was the unsettling feeling in her chest that kept her awake now. The small, inconspicuous pendant she had discovered at the estate kept replaying in her mind, its cold, broken form telling a story that wasn't quite clear. And the ledger, the financial transactions, that was the key, wasn't it? The connection between St. Clair and Eleanor Willingham, something deep, hidden, dark that no one had noticed before. But the pieces were not falling into place quickly enough. There was something or someone who was working against her. That much was becoming painfully obvious. As Miss Marple sat there, pondering her next move, she heard footsteps outside the door. They were deliberate and slow, too slow for someone who was hurrying. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Lord Philip entered without a word, his face taut with frustration, his eyes avoiding hers. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice rough, "you're making a mistake. You think you've uncovered something, but you're wrong. You're wrong about everything." His tone had lost the earlier nervous edge, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. She knew that the pressure was building. His mind was scrambling to keep up the lies, but Miss Marple had seen enough to know that truth always had a way of breaking through. "Lord Philip," she said, leaning forward, her voice steady, "you've already given me everything I need to prove your involvement. The transactions, the pendant, the connection to Anton St. Clair, everything is connected. Why don't you just tell me the truth?" He opened his mouth to speak, but just then a crash from the hallway interrupted them. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the manor, causing them both to jump. Miss Marple rose quickly, her instincts telling her this was no ordinary interruption. She moved toward the door, Lord Philip hesitating behind her. They stepped into the hallway, the air thick with tension. The sound had come from the study next door, the room where Miss Marple had kept the ledger and the pendant, both crucial pieces of evidence. She felt her stomach tighten, dread crawling up her spine as she hurried toward the door. The room was in disarray. The once neat piles of books had been scattered across the floor, papers strewn about in a hasty manner, and most telling of all, the desk was completely cleared. The ledger, the pendant, everything she had been working with, was gone. For a moment, Miss Marple could hardly believe her eyes. She knew exactly what this meant. Someone had taken the evidence, and they were doing everything in their power to bury the truth. Lord Philip stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "This is exactly what I feared," Miss Marple muttered, under her breath. "Someone is working against me, trying to cover their tracks before I can expose them." She didn't need to say more. He already knew. But who? And why now? The question hung in the air like a noxious fog. Miss Marple turned quickly, pacing the hallway as her mind whirred with possibilities. The question now was not whether someone had stolen the evidence. It was why. Who would be so desperate to cover their involvement? Was it someone close to Eleanor Willingham? Or perhaps someone with deeper ties to St. Clair? Lord Philip's voice interrupted her thoughts. I didn't do this, Miss Marple. I haven't taken anything." "I know," she replied quietly, but the words lacked any conviction. He was standing too far from her now, the once direct connection between them fraying. He might not have taken the evidence himself, but someone close to him had. Her thoughts raced through the suspects. Lord Philip had clearly been acting suspiciously, but had he truly been the mastermind behind this? Was it possible someone else had been working in the shadows, pulling strings? She thought of his mother, Lady Evelyn. The stakes had always been high for the Willinghams. Money, power, a carefully cultivated reputation that stretched far beyond this estate. "Someone is trying to stop me," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "and I don't think it's Lord Philip." Lord Philip watched her, his face tight with frustration. "I don't understand why you're still digging, Miss Marple. There's nothing more here. Nothing to find. You've done enough. Let it go." But Miss Marple, ever patient and meticulous, was not one to let things go, not when there was still so much at stake. She glanced back at the destroyed study, the papers scattered on the floor. Her gaze flicked to the doorframe, where she could see the faint outline of fingerprints on the wood. Whoever had taken the evidence hadn't been careful, and their hasty actions might just leave a trace. It was a small lead, but it was something. Miss Marple was already moving before Lord Philip could protest further. The trail led her to the servants' quarters at the back of the manor, an area she had yet to visit. The footsteps she had heard earlier, the ones that had led her to the study, seemed to echo again in her mind. Someone in this house knew more than they were letting on. But who? And how could they have gained access to the study without raising suspicion? Miss Marple didn't waste time. She moved swiftly, her mind calculating every possibility. As she passed through the narrow hallways, she came to a sudden stop. The old maid, Rose, was standing near the entrance to the servants' stairwell, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Rose," she said, her voice measured. "I need to ask you a few questions." The maid stiffened, her eyes darting toward the door. "I'm sorry, miss, I don't think there's anything I can—" Miss Marple stepped closer, her tone soft but unwavering. "You're in more trouble than you realize, Rose. You've been in the study, haven't you?" The maid's face went pale. For a moment she seemed to lose all composure, but only for a fraction of a second. Then, with remarkable speed, her expression shifted to one of feigned innocence. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I haven't been in the study, I swear it." But Miss Marple could see the crack in her composure. She was lying. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the briefest moment, Miss Marple felt a flash of satisfaction. She had found her first real clue. "Rose," Miss Marple said quietly, "where is the ledger? And where is the pendant?" The maid swallowed hard. The lies she had told before hung on the edge of her lips, but now there was no denying it. The pieces were falling into place. Miss Marple's eyes were steady as she watched Rose's face fall, the truth finally creeping to the surface. Miss Marple stood still, her eyes narrowing as she watched Rose's demeanor crumble. The maid's hands shook visibly, and the deflection in her eyes was all too telling. She had been caught, and now the truth hung in the air like a suffocating fog. I don't know where they are," Rose stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to—" But before Miss Marple could respond, a sharp, guttural scream pierced the stillness of the house, sending a jolt through her. It was a sound that no one could mistake, the voice of Lady Evelyn, shrill and desperate, coming from the upper floors. Without a second thought, Miss Marple turned and bolted up the stairs, the pounding of her own feet matching the frantic rhythm of her heart. Behind her, she could hear Lord Philip shouting, his footsteps clattering against the marble as he followed. The scream came again, louder this time, and Miss Marple's pace quickened, her mind already working through the possibilities. Lady Evelyn, the seemingly innocent, well-dressed matriarch, had been a critical piece of the puzzle. She had ties to St. Clair, to the Willingham fortune, and now, as the house seemed to close in on its secrets, Miss Marple couldn't shake the suspicion that Lady Evelyn was a far more central figure than anyone had realized. When Miss Marple reached the top of the stairs, she found the door to Lady Evelyn's suite ajar, the muffled sound of frantic movement coming from within. The air smelled faintly of perfume, a sharp floral scent, but it was quickly being overwhelmed by the growing tension in the house. She stepped cautiously into the room, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Lady Evelyn was sitting on the floor by the window, her face pale and twisted with horror, her hands clutching at the curtains. The woman's breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes wide with fear. "Lady Evelyn," What has happened? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm yet firm, trying to steady the woman's nerves. She's gone. She's gone, Lady Evelyn cried, her voice breaking. She raised one trembling hand toward the far side of the room, where the door to a small study stood ajar. The study was empty, but Miss Marple noticed at once that the window was wide open. The heavy curtains were fluttering in the breeze, but the glass was still intact. Someone had left in a hurry. But it wasn't just that. The desk in the corner was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. But that wasn't the most disturbing sight. On the rug near the desk was a bloodstain, a large dark pool of it. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she quickly crouched down, inspecting it closely. It wasn't fresh. It had already begun to congeal. But it wasn't an accident. That much was clear. The blood had been carefully placed, smeared in a deliberate pattern, not the result of a struggle. Who was it, Lady Evelyn? Who has done this? Miss Marple asked, her voice steady, though her thoughts raced. Lady Evelyn's eyes locked on the bloodstain, her lips trembling. It's Eleanor. She was here. She was just here. Miss Marple's mind raced. Eleanor Willingham, the woman whose tragic end had set everything into motion, had been dead. Her body found in the locked room, the scene that had initially seemed so clear. But now, Lady Evelyn's words sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. Had Eleanor been here? Or was this something more sinister, another layer of deception waiting to be uncovered? Before Miss Marple could press further, there was another sound, a thud, followed by a loud crash from the hallway. She turned sharply only to see a dark figure dart past the doorframe and disappear into the shadows. "After them," Miss Marple shouted, but she didn't need to say it twice. Lord Philip was already moving, his face filled with urgency, but Miss Marple was quicker, stepping forward and grabbing the handle of the study door. She didn't wait for him to catch up. She didn't have time. The figure had vanished down the long corridor, but Miss Marple was relentless. She could feel it. She was being drawn into the labyrinth of lies, with each turn more dangerous than the last. Whoever it was, they had a head start. But they would not escape her grasp. She rounded the corner just in time to see a shadow slipping into a nearby storage closet, its door creaking shut behind them. Miss Marple was upon it in seconds, twisting the knob and throwing the door wide open. The closet was empty, but it wasn't. There, tucked away in the farthest corner, lying discarded among old linens, was something that had not been there before, a large blood-stained knife. Miss Marple's stomach lurched as she picked it up, feeling the cold metal in her hand. There were traces of fresh blood on the blade, and the pattern, she realized, matched the blood stain from the study. It was a message. "Where is Eleanor?" she whispered under her breath. The sound of footsteps approached, and Lord Philip came around the corner, panting, his face flushed with exertion. "Miss Marple," he gasped. "There's been another murder." Her blood ran cold at his words. She had known it was only a matter of time, but to hear it confirmed in such a blunt, horrifying way took the breath from her lungs. "Who?" she asked, already knowing the answer, but hoping against hope that it wasn't true. "Eleanor. She's gone. Someone killed her." Miss Marple took a step back, the world feeling suddenly too small, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Eleanor's body had been found. She had died weeks ago, or had she? The bloodstains, the sudden disappearance of the evidence, and now the renewed crime, all pointed to the same cruel realization. Whoever was behind this was still very much in control, still several steps ahead. Whoever is doing this is playing a very dangerous game, Miss Marple murmured, and it's far from over. She turned to Lord Philip, her mind already racing ahead. We need to find out where Eleanor has gone, if she's even gone at all. Someone is trying to erase her death. His eyes widened as the full implication of her words sank in. But how? Why? Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice unyielding. Because the truth is worth more than any life, Lord Philip. And whoever is behind this is determined to make sure that truth never sees the light of day. The chase had begun again, and this time Miss Marple would not stop until every last piece of the puzzle was put in place. No matter the cost, Miss Marple sat at the small writing desk in the quiet corner of the drawing room, her fingers lightly tapping on the worn surface, her mind piecing together the events that had unfolded so far. The tangled web of lies, betrayals, and murder had only grown more convoluted with each passing day. But now, after the latest turn in the investigation, a realization was beginning to crystallize. She glanced down at the small collection of notes scattered before her, clippings from newspapers, scribbled statements from witnesses, and her own observations. Her eyes lingered over them all, searching for something she had missed. Every word, every detail seemed important, but there had to be something small that would break the case wide open. A sudden thought flashed through her mind. An offhand comment made by one of the servants, something she hadn't fully appreciated at the time. Rose, in the midst of her distress after the discovery of Lady Evelyn's panic, had mentioned how strange it was that Lady Evelyn had spent so much time staring out the window in recent weeks. Miss Marple had dismissed it as idle chatter, a symptom of the stress surrounding the family, but now the phrase gnawed at her. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked over to the window in the drawing room, peering out into the darkening garden below. The view was serene, yet there was something unsettling about it. No one had ever remarked on it before, yet Miss Marple felt the pressure building in her chest as the thought took root. Lady Evelyn had spent an unusual amount of time staring out this very window. But why? Was there something outside that drew her attention? The answer hit Miss Marple like a bolt of lightning. Of course, the garden. No, the path leading from the estate toward the stables. It was a simple detail, one that seemed insignificant in the larger scheme of things, but now it felt like a key. Lady Evelyn hadn't been waiting for a visitor. She hadn't been admiring the flowers or lost in thought. She had been watching someone or something leave. Miss Marple, I need to speak with you. Lord Philip's voice broke through her musings. His tone was strained, and she could hear the rush of his breath as though he had been running. He stepped into the room, his usual composure replaced with something more urgent. Miss Marple turned to face him, nodding in greeting. I believe I know what you want to say, she said quietly, a sharpness to her voice that immediately caught his attention. It's about the garden, isn't it? He blinked, taken aback. The garden? The path leading to the stables, she clarified, her eyes never leaving his face. I've been thinking. There's something that's been overlooked. Lord Philip was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if processing her words. What do you mean? Think back. To the evening of Eleanor's disappearance, Miss Marple continued. Lady Evelyn had been watching out of that window, hadn't she? She'd been watching someone leave, someone connected to Eleanor's death. I now suspect that Lady Evelyn wasn't as shocked or innocent as she pretended. She knew exactly what was going on. Lord Philip took a step back, his brow furrowing. "You think Lady Evelyn was involved?" Miss Marple's lips tightened into a thin line. "Not just involved. She's been hiding something. I think she's been hiding someone." A silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of her words. The answer was right there, but Lord Philip still didn't understand. Miss Marple took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts before speaking again. "Earlier I asked you about the missing evidence, the bloodstains, the knife. Someone deliberately removed it, and for good reason. It was an attempt to bury the truth, but they didn't succeed. The garden, Lord Philip. It's the key. If you remember the details of Eleanor's case, the body was found in a locked room, wasn't it? But why go to all the trouble of making it seem like an impossible murder if they could have simply disposed of the body elsewhere? Why stage everything? Lord Philip shook his head in confusion. I'm still not sure what you're saying. The garden, the path. It's a distraction, Miss Marple said softly. A carefully constructed one. You see, I believe the crime didn't happen in the way we first thought. Eleanor didn't die in that locked room. She was already dead when she was placed there. Lady Evelyn had a hand in this, I'm certain of it. And the garden? He asked, more to himself, now trying to piece it together. The garden is where the real action occurred, Miss Marple continued. You've mentioned before that there are strange details about the Willingham family's finances. I think it wasn't just the inheritance or the money that was the motivation here. It was something else, something far more personal. Lord Philip looked at her with a dawning sense of realization. The connection. You think there's a link between the deaths? Something that goes beyond what we assumed. Miss Marple smiled, a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Exactly. This is not just a murder. It's a long-standing scheme, one that's been building for years. Someone wanted something from the Willingham family, and that someone wasn't acting alone. Lord Philip stepped back, his hand gripping the back of a chair for support. But who would do something like this? Who would be capable of it? That's what we need to find out, Miss Marple said, her voice firm. But the pattern is there, Lord Philip. It's all connected, the bloodstains, the garden, the locked room. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a calculated move, and it's been happening under our noses the entire time. As Miss Marple spoke, she began to understand the depth of the deception. Each piece of the puzzle, no matter how seemingly trivial, had a purpose. A comment made in passing, a gesture, a small detail that had been overlooked. These were the things that had led her here. The longer she thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. The key to this mystery had been in plain sight all along. It wasn't just about who had committed the murders. It was about why they had been committed, and how each piece of the puzzle had been deliberately manipulated. The next step was clear. They had to go back to the beginning, retracing every move, every conversation, and every look. Only then could they uncover the person behind this twisted scheme. But Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. The truth was closer than anyone realized, and she would find it. The evening air was thick with tension as Miss Marple sat in the wide-eyed, dimly lit study, carefully watching the faces of those gathered around her. Lord Philip, still clearly shaken by the revelations of the last few days, had grown quiet, his mind struggling to catch up with the events unfolding before him. He had been present for the unraveling of the facts, but now he seemed lost in the depths of it all, as if grappling with the enormity of what had been hidden from view. There were more questions now than answers, but Miss Marple wasn't daunted. Her keen eyes had seen through the fog of deception, and each moment brought her closer to uncovering the ugly truth. She knew that every person in this room was tied to the crime in some way. Every piece of the puzzle she'd gathered was now building toward a singular conclusion, and it was not just a tale of revenge, greed, or jealousy. No, this was something far deeper, something more insidious. The real motive, the true reason behind the killings, was hiding beneath layers of misdirection. And now it was time for it to come into the light. Miss Marple cleared her throat, drawing the attention of those gathered. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of crackling firewood in the hearth. The shadows on the walls seemed to deepen, adding to the growing sense of unease. "There is more to this crime than any of you realize," she began, her voice steady, yet heavy with conviction. "The killings weren't about inheritance or about the money. No, the true reason is far more complex." Lord Philip looked at her, his face pale. "Then what is it? What could possibly explain everything that's happened?" Miss Marple met his gaze directly, her eyes sharp with understanding. "It's the psychology of the person behind this," she said slowly, as though testing the weight of the words before speaking them aloud. "The person who orchestrated these murders wasn't after wealth, though that was certainly part of the game. They weren't motivated by a thirst for power, nor by a desire to see a rival brought low. No, the true motive is one rooted deep in a warped need for control and validation." There was a collective stir in the room as her words settled over them. The various faces seemed to freeze, their expressions shifting from skepticism to a quiet realization. They knew instinctively that Miss Marple was about to reveal something that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. "You see," she continued, "the villain we are dealing with is not simply a murderer. This is someone who has spent their entire life craving control over the people around them. Someone who needed to prove their worth through manipulation, through causing others to bow to their will. But that was never enough. No. To truly feel powerful, they had to feel untouchable, invincible even. And what better way to achieve that than to carefully orchestrate a crime so intricate, so impossible to solve, that no one would ever suspect them? The realization hit like a thunderclap. "Lady Evelyn," Lord Philip whispered, his voice barely audible. Miss Marple nodded, but there was no triumph in her expression, only quiet understanding. Yes, Lady Evelyn had been hiding in plain sight. The patterns, the subtle manipulations, the careful game she played with the people around her, it was all a performance. And it worked. For a time. "But why?" Lord Philip asked, his voice shaking. "Why kill your own sister? What could drive her to this?" Miss Marple glanced around the room, noting the various reactions, the disbelief on the faces of the servants, the stunned silence of the family, and the way they all seemed to be looking to her for an answer, as if she could make sense of it all. Because it wasn't just about control, it was about proving to herself that she could outwit everyone, outlive everyone. She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. Lady Evelyn and Eleanor had a relationship unlike any we imagined. They were not merely sisters. They were rivals, locked in a silent, constant battle for supremacy. But it wasn't about love or affection. It was about dominance. Lord Philip's face twisted with confusion. But Eleanor was so gentle. She would never have— Eleanor wasn't the saint she appeared to be, Miss Marple interjected. She played her part well, a quiet, sweet woman who seemed to be no threat to anyone. But under that surface she had her own dark motivations. She had made some powerful enemies, and her death wasn't as simple as it seemed. There was a long pause as everyone in the room absorbed her words. A quiet tension stretched thin, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Lady Evelyn killed her sister because Eleanor posed a threat to everything Lady Evelyn had spent years building. Miss Marple continued. Eleanor had learned the truth about Lady Evelyn's dark secrets, her schemes, her years of manipulations. And Eleanor had become a liability. She wasn't just a sister. She was a witness, someone who could tear apart the web Lady Evelyn had so carefully constructed. Lord Philip's face had gone ashen. "And the others?" he asked hoarsely. "The servants? The guests?" Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes darkening. They were pawns in her game. Lady Evelyn had mastered the art of turning people into instruments of her will. She had no intention of letting anyone stand in her way. "And the motive for the murders? The attacks on the guests? The evidence tampering?" Lord Philip asked, still struggling to wrap his mind around it all. "The answer lies in her need to feel untouchable, Lord Philip. She wanted to create a situation so tangled, so complex, that no one could ever accuse her. But it wasn't just about getting away with murder. It was about the rush she felt, the power of watching people stumble, watching them fail while she pulled the strings behind the scenes. A chill spread through the room as Miss Marple's words sank in. The true depth of Lady Evelyn's depravity was beginning to crystallize, and it was clear that she had been playing a game with everyone, not just the family but the entire town too. Her manipulation had been so expertly executed that no one had suspected her, and no one could have imagined that she was capable of such extreme measures. But now it was all falling apart. Lord Philip let out a slow breath, his expression turning from shock to a grim determination. "She'll never get away with it, will she?" Miss Marple met his gaze with a knowing look. "No. The truth is already out. It's just a matter of time before she's caught. And once she is, the full extent of her motives will be laid bare for everyone to see." The air in the room seemed to lighten, as though the weight of the mystery had finally been lifted. Lady Evelyn's carefully constructed facade had crumbled, and the truth stood naked before them all. But Miss Marple knew that the real battle was yet to come. The revelation of her twisted motives had only just begun. The evening had drawn in quickly, and the manor was shrouded in the darkness of night. The flickering light of the candles cast long shadows across the hallways, and the soft murmur of the wind outside seemed to whisper of something impending. Miss Marple stood at the window, her hands folded neatly in front of her, observing the world beyond as if it were nothing more than a small stage for a much grander play. The pieces had all fallen into place. Lady Evelyn had been cornered, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. The psychological web she had so carefully spun was unraveling thread by thread, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the moment pressing down upon her. She had already arranged the trap, subtle yet precise. There was no room for error. It was nearly time. The sounds of footsteps reached her ears, growing louder with each passing second. She turned slightly, just enough to see the people entering the room. Lord Philip stood to her right, his face set in a tense expression. Beside him, the officers who had been aiding in the investigation looked like they had just stepped into the unknown. Even they couldn't shake off the growing sense of apprehension that clung to the air. "You're certain?" Lord Philip's voice was almost a whisper, betraying a hint of doubt. Miss Marple turned to face him, her calm demeanour as unshakable as ever. "It's all in place, my dear. Lady Evelyn is about to make the mistake of her life." They both turned their attention to the door. Moments later, Lady Evelyn herself entered the room, her presence almost suffocating in its intensity. The former Countess had always carried an air of grandeur, a sense of unassailable power that seemed to emanate from her every gesture. But now, something in her movements betrayed the strain she'd been under in the last few days. The mask of control she had worn so carefully was slipping. She paused when she saw the group, her eyes scanning the room with a cool, calculating gaze. "What is this?" Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath the surface that even she couldn't hide. "What do you all want now?" Miss Marple regarded her silently for a moment before stepping forward. "Lady Evelyn," she said, her voice calm yet carrying an undeniable weight, "you've been playing a very dangerous game, but the time for deception is over." Lady Evelyn's lips curled into a thin, tight smile. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea what you think you know, Miss Marple, but this is all very beneath me. We both know that's not true." Miss Marple's words were sharp, but still there was no rush in her tone. She knew this moment would come, and she had waited for it with a patience that most would find unnerving. "You've spent your life manipulating the people around you, hiding the truth behind layers of lies. But all your secrets are now exposed." Lady Evelyn's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, but she quickly regained control. "I've done nothing wrong. You're just—" Her voice trailed off, and for the first time Miss Marple saw the faintest flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was too late. The trap had already been set. Lady Evelyn's posture stiffened as she turned toward Lord Philip, her voice sharp and cold. You told her everything?" Her eyes flicked to the officers behind him, now standing like silent sentinels. "You would believe this woman over me?" "I've known the truth for quite some time, Lady Evelyn," Lord Philip said, his voice low and unwavering. "Miss Marple didn't need to tell me anything. I saw it for myself. All the lies, all the deception. You thought you could control everything, everyone, but you couldn't control the one thing that mattered most, yourself." Lady Evelyn's face drained of colour, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing. "You think you know me? You think you know what I'm capable of?" she spat. "You have no idea what I've done to get here. You have no idea the price I've paid." At that moment, Miss Marple knew Lady Evelyn was teetering on the edge. The desperation in her voice, the rapid way she was grasping for something to hold on to, it was the unmistakable sign of a woman who had no more moves left. There was nothing left for her but to break or to lash out. The sound of something shifting in the corner of the room caught Miss Marple's attention. For a split second, Lady Evelyn's eyes flicked toward it, a flash of panic visible before she masked it behind her calm exterior. Miss Marple, however, had already seen the glint of something sharp, a small, concealed weapon hidden under her cloak. Her mind raced. Before Lady Evelyn could make a move, Miss Marple spoke with a finality that brought the entire room to a halt. "I think you should put that down, Lady Evelyn. There's no need for any more violence. You've already dug your grave." The tension in the room intensified. Lady Evelyn's fingers twitched, and for a moment it seemed as if she might attempt to make a run for it, but the officers were already closing in. She was trapped. With a sudden, sharp motion, Lady Evelyn pulled the weapon from her cloak, a silver dagger gleaming under the candlelight. The room held its breath, and for a moment everything seemed suspended in time. But Miss Marple didn't flinch. She didn't show any sign of fear. Instead, she watched calmly as Lady Evelyn's eyes filled with fury and frustration. "You have no idea who I am. I'll make you regret this, Miss Marple. You'll all regret this." "Regret it?" Miss Marple's voice remained steady, though it was now tinged with something heavier. Finality, perhaps. "I don't think you understand, Lady Evelyn. You've already lost." And then, in an instant, the trap closed. The officers lunged forward, and Lady Evelyn's brief moment of defiance crumbled. She was caught, the weapon clattering to the floor as she was restrained and taken into custody. As she was led away, Miss Marple turned back to Lord Philip, her expression softening slightly. "It's over. She'll face the consequences of her actions, all of them." Lord Philip's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the entire case had finally lifted. "I can't believe it. After everything." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said quietly, "the truth is the simplest thing of all. But it's buried so deep, it takes a steady hand to uncover it." The last of the evening's tension evaporated as Lady Evelyn was led out of the room, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, the air felt clear. The last chapter had been written, the case was closed, and Miss Marple, as always, remained as calm as the steady hand that had unravelled the entire mystery. The echoes of Lady Evelyn's arrest still lingered in the grand manor, the weight of the evening's events settling over the household like a thick fog. Miss Marple, ever composed, stood by the window once more, her eyes scanning the now quiet grounds. The stars above seemed to twinkle with a quiet sense of finality. "Do you think it's really over?" Lord Philip's voice broke the silence as he approached her, his hands clasped behind his back. There was a new wariness in his eyes, a lingering uncertainty that refused to shake free, even after the woman who had caused so much damage had been removed from the equation. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She simply turned her gaze. To him, her eyes sharp and clear. She knew what was going through his mind, the questions, the lingering doubts. It was only natural to wonder if they had truly solved everything, or if something had slipped through the cracks. "There's one thing I've learned over the years, Lord Philip," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady and unyielding. "Nothing is ever as simple as it appears. No, I don't think it's over. Not yet." Lord Philip frowned, confusion creasing his brow. "But surely Lady Evelyn confessed. Everything points to her. She had the means, the opportunity, and the motive. The weapon was right there." "Too convenient," Miss Marple interjected, her gaze narrowing slightly. "That was the first thing that made me suspicious. A confession, a weapon, and no struggle. All neatly tied up in a bow, just waiting to be wrapped and presented. It's almost as if someone wanted us to think it was her." The words hung in the air, heavy with the implication that the solution was far from as straightforward as it appeared. Lord Philip's face slowly shifted from confusion to realization, as though he was finally grasping the depths of what Miss Marple was suggesting. "You think someone else was behind it?" he asked quietly, his voice tense. Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Instead, she walked over to the small desk near the fireplace and picked up a letter that had been discarded on the surface. It was one of many she had found earlier in the investigation, a note that had been in Lady Evelyn's study and which had seemed insignificant at the time. She turned it over slowly in her hands, carefully inspecting the handwriting once more. It had been one of the first things she'd set aside after discovering Lady Evelyn's connection to the crime. But now, something about the letter called her attention again. A faint shift in the ink, the way the letter was folded, details that seemed so small yet so crucial. "What are you thinking?" Lord Philip asked, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "There's a name in this letter, Lord Philip, one that I didn't notice at first." Miss Marple's voice was almost whisper-soft as she unfolded the paper, her fingers tracing the delicate curves of the ink. "It's addressed to someone who isn't even part of the investigation, but it's someone who could have been, someone who is far too well placed to have been overlooked." Lord Philip leaned in, eyes widening as Miss Marple spoke the name. "Lydia Calhoun." "Yes, Lydia Calhoun," Miss Marple repeated, her tone deliberate. "The name in the letter was hers. It's only a small mention, but it's enough to raise questions. A cousin of Lady Evelyn, a woman known to have lived abroad for years, and who, until now, had no known connection to the events surrounding the murder. But why? What possible link could she have had?" Lord Philip's voice was now filled with a blend of disbelief and growing fear. "Lydia Calhoun hasn't been in the country for years. She left long before Lady Evelyn's marriage, and surely—" "That's just it," Miss Marple interrupted gently, her mind already working through the pieces. "She left before Lady Evelyn married your father, didn't she? She left before. The family fortunes began to change. She left just before everything became tangled, but she never completely severed her ties to the family. She's been watching all along, perhaps biding her time." The weight of the words settled heavily on them both, the tension in the room growing palpable as Miss Marple continued to unravel the new layer of the mystery. "This is far from over, Lord Philip. Lady Evelyn may have been a part of the crime, but I'm beginning to believe she wasn't the true mastermind. The more I think about it, the more it all seems to have been a carefully orchestrated diversion." "So, you think Lydia Calhoun was behind it all?" Lord Philip asked, his voice low, a mixture of disbelief and fear creeping into his tone. "But why? What could her motive be?" Miss Marple turned slowly toward him, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Motive, my dear, is a complex thing. Sometimes the strongest motivations are not the most obvious. Sometimes the deepest wounds are those that have festered over many years." Lord Philip's face paled. "You're saying she has a personal vendetta against the family?" "In a way," Miss Marple said, her voice taking on a deeper, more contemplative tone. "I believe Lydia Calhoun felt slighted by Lady Evelyn's marriage to your father. There were rumours, you know, about the true nature of their relationship. Lady Evelyn, the woman who appeared to have everything while Lydia was left in the shadows, cast aside. Perhaps it was jealousy that drove her, a need to gain control once more. Perhaps she was never as distant from the family as everyone believed." "Lord." Philip's eyes widened as he processed her words. "But how could she have been involved in Lady Evelyn's arrest if she's been living overseas?" Miss Marple's expression hardened. "That's the last piece of the puzzle. Lydia Calhoun never truly left the family. She's been living under a different identity, somewhere right under our noses. The motive was there all along, buried, beneath years of carefully crafted lies. But how do you know for sure? Lord Philip asked, the uncertainty still lingering in his voice. The letter, Lord Philip, Miss Marple said, her eyes now filled with the same certainty that had driven her throughout the case. It wasn't just a letter, it was a key. Lydia's return, her manipulation of Lady Evelyn, it all fits. It's the perfect plan to deceive everyone into thinking that Lady Evelyn was the guilty party, and now she's gone into hiding, watching as the truth closes in on her. Just as she finished speaking, the door to the room swung open, and a young officer entered, panting with urgency. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "we found something, an address. It's Lydia Calhoun's. She's still in the country, and she's been using a false identity." Miss Marple turned to Lord Philip, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "It seems, my dear, that we were right all along. The final piece of the puzzle has been found." Before Lord Philip could speak, Miss Marple was already moving, her every step precise and purposeful. The trap had closed on one villain, but there was still another to catch. The final twist had arrived, and now the game would come to its ultimate conclusion. And for Miss Marple, it was just another day of solving the unsolvable. The faint hum of the carriages outside the manor sounded distant, their wheels rolling over the cobblestones as Lord Philip stood by the door, his hand clenched tightly on the handle. Miss Marple stood beside him, her presence calm but unwavering as the officers readied themselves. A deep silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft rustling of the letters that Miss Marple had placed neatly on the table earlier. The room felt unusually still, as if even the walls were holding their breath in anticipation. For all the certainty Miss Marple had displayed in her deductions, there was still a palpable tension. The final confrontation had come. "Miss Marple," Lord Philip spoke at last, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Are you certain this is it? That we've caught her?" Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She adjusted her glasses, which had slipped slightly down her nose, and turned toward the window, gazing out into the growing dusk. There was something about this moment, something that felt unfinished. "Lord Philip," she began softly, "the pieces have all fit together so neatly, haven't they? Too neatly, in fact. Lydia Calhoun hiding under a false name, the carefully orchestrated deception that led us to believe Lady Evelyn was the guilty party. It all makes sense. But there is still something—" Her words trailed off as she looked down at the now empty space where the final clue had once been. A subtle sound, like a footstep behind them, made Miss Marple turn. The officer had returned, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Miss Marple," he gasped, breathless with the news. "We've checked Lydia Calhoun's address. She's gone, vanished." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, though she did not show it. She had known there was more to the story, and as unsettling as it was, she couldn't bring herself to be surprised. Lydia had been hiding too carefully, playing the role of the innocent victim for too long. To simply believe in her arrest would be naive. No, the truth had to go deeper. There was something, some final twist waiting in the shadows, ready to emerge. Lord Philip's jaw tightened. "You mean she's escaped? After everything?" "Indeed," the officer confirmed. "We found a hidden compartment in the house, empty, but for a few scattered personal effects. No sign of a struggle, no indication of where she went." Miss Marple took a deep breath, a look of calm determination settling on her face. It's always the small details, she murmured to herself. The ones that everyone overlooks. Lord Philip's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I've been thinking about it all along, she said slowly, her gaze lifting as her mind worked through the final moments of the case. It wasn't the letters or the confession. It was the way Lydia disappeared so effortlessly, too easily. This was never a woman in hiding. This was a woman who had been preparing for this moment for years. She knew we would be coming for her, and she was ready. Ready? Lord Philip echoed. But how? How could she have possibly known? The only explanation that makes sense, Miss Marple interrupted, her voice sharp, is that someone else tipped her off. Someone who had been playing a part all along. Someone we never truly suspected. She turned to the officer. Go to Lady Evelyn's residence immediately. Search again. There may be something we missed. A letter, a hidden message, anything that could connect the last missing link. I'll explain everything once you return. The officer nodded and hastily left the room, but Miss Marple did not move. Her mind was far ahead, piecing the final clues together, the ones she had stored away in the recesses of her mind. Lord Philip watched her, the weight of uncertainty heavy on his shoulders. So you think this whole thing was a set-up? Yes, Miss Marple replied firmly, a perfect set-up, not just for Lady Evelyn, but for all of us. Lydia knew that eventually we would come to her, just as I knew it. The question was always going to be, who helped her? Who was the real mastermind? A shiver ran down Lord Philip's spine as realization dawned on him. Do you think it could have been? He stopped himself, the thought too awful to voice aloud. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. It could have been him, your father. The one person no one would ever suspect. For a long moment there was silence between them. The weight of the accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But why? Why would he help her? Lord Philip finally whispered, as if the question could shatter everything he believed. Miss Marple gave a soft, knowing sigh. Because he needed her. There was too much at stake. The family fortune, the legacy, the power. Your father was desperate, Lord Philip, desperate to maintain control, and Lydia Calhoun was the key. She was not just a woman scorned. She was a tool, a weapon, to be used in his quest for power. And Lady Evelyn? She paused, choosing her words carefully. She became an obstacle. Lord Philip stood frozen, his mind racing through the revelations like a storm. The world he had known, the world of high society and wealth, was crumbling before his eyes, revealing the darkness that lay beneath. Do you think he knew about everything that happened to his wife? He asked, voice shaking. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the desk and placed her hand on the stack of papers, each one representing a clue, a piece of the puzzle. The evidence suggests that your father was aware. He may not have been directly involved in the murders, but he played a significant role in manipulating events from the shadows. Before Lord Philip could respond, the officer returned, his face grim. Miss Marple, he said softly, we found something. He handed her a small envelope, sealed with the familiar wax crest of the family. Miss Marple broke the seal and read the letter inside. Well, this is certainly illuminating, she muttered under her breath, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. She turned to Lord Philip, holding up the letter. I knew it, she said, her voice tinged with satisfaction. It's from your father, A letter to Lydia Calhoun instructing her to leave the country once Lady Evelyn was arrested. The message is clear. The job is done. Lord Philip's face drained of colour. So it was him. He orchestrated it all. Miss Marple nodded, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Your father, Lord Philip, has been playing both sides of the game. He wanted his wife out of the picture, and he used Lydia as a pawn in his scheme. What he didn't count on, however, was someone as persistent as me uncovering his secrets. There was no more room for doubt. The truth had been revealed. But even as Miss Marple stood there, contemplating the depths of the deception, a lingering unease settled over her. Justice had been served in part, but the true villain remained a step ahead. Lord Philip's father would face his consequences, but there was still a darker truth at play, the lengths to which some would go to protect their secrets. As the officers prepared to move on his location, Miss Marple turned away from the window, her expression unreadable. Justice, Lord Philip, may be delayed, but it will always come. And when it does, no one will escape. But as the heavy doors of the manor creaked open, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone else was watching, waiting for their turn in the shadows. As the officers moved swiftly, the heavy thud of their boots echoing down the halls, Miss Marple stood still, her eyes fixed on the now empty chair where Lord Philip had been moments before. She could sense the tension thick in the air, a strange stillness settling over the house. Lord Philip had left to oversee the final steps of his father's arrest, his expression a mixture of disbelief and resolve. And yet, as Miss Marple observed, the scene around her something still felt unfinished. The case had been solved, at least in the conventional sense. Lydia Calhoun's involvement had been exposed. Lord Philip's father was poised to face justice for his role in the tragic events that had unfolded. Lady Evelyn's death, long shrouded in mystery, now had an answer. Yet, Miss Marple couldn't quite shake the sensation that deep within the confines of this tangled web, there was still a hidden thread left unpulled. She stood by the fireplace, her hand resting gently on the cool, smooth surface of the mantel. It was in these quiet moments that she often found clarity. Her gaze fell to the letter in her hand, the letter from Lord Philip's father to Lydia, which had served as the final piece of the puzzle. And yet, as she reread the words, she felt a strange sensation trickle down her spine. The finality of the letter seemed too clean, too convenient. Had it been written hastily, in a panic, or was it carefully composed with a particular intention in mind? There was something about it, a slight shift in the rhythm of the words, a turn of phrase that seemed off-key. Miss Marple could not place it at first, but she was certain of one thing. She had missed something. A small detail, one so subtle that it had slipped under the radar of the investigation. She could feel it pressing against the edges of her thoughts, a nagging question she couldn't yet answer. As the evening stretched on, the manor grew darker. The last of the officers departed, their shadows casting long across the hallway, and the stillness of the place felt heavy, almost suffocating. Miss Marple's mind continued to churn, the scent of old paper and ink filling the air as she examined the letter one more time. She turned it over in her hands, noting the fine quality of the paper, the way the wax seal had been pressed. Nothing particularly out of the ordinary, but the message didn't sit right. The fire crackled in the background as Miss Marple leaned in, inspecting the signature once more. The ink had been applied in an unusually hurried manner. A slight smudge near the last letter, one that seemed out of place. It was almost as if the writer had been interrupted. But who would interrupt Lord Philip's father at that particular moment? Why would the urgency to send such a message be so compelling that it would cause him to make such a hasty, careless mistake? Miss Marple's thoughts turned sharply. The possibilities began to form. She had assumed that the letter was meant to be the final confirmation, the piece of evidence that tied everything together. But now, she realized, it might not be as clear-cut as it seemed. There was someone, perhaps even something, missing from this picture. She sat back, letting the letter fall onto the table as her gaze shifted toward the window. The moon was rising, casting pale light over the rolling landscape. The calmness of the scene contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in her mind. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the puzzle of Lady Evelyn's death was but one layer of a far larger mystery, one that was beginning to surface in the most unexpected of ways. "Miss Marple?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find the young officer who had just returned from the family estate. His face was drawn, his expression conflicted, but there was something in his eyes that told her everything. "We've found something," he said, his words slow but deliberate. "It's about the letter. There's another, hidden inside." Her heart skipped a beat. She rose from her chair, the calm, composed detective now stirred by an unexpected rush of urgency. The officer handed her a second letter, one that had been carefully concealed within the folds of the first. Miss Marple broke the seal with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the words quickly. The message was not what she had expected. It was a brief, cryptic note that read, "Do not trust the witness. The truth is buried beneath the lies. Only you can stop the final act. P." A chill ran down her spine. The letter was from P. But who was this, and why was this hidden? What was the truth buried beneath the lies? The questions began to flood her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. The officer, clearly unsettled by the revelation, spoke in a low voice. "We've searched every room, Miss Marple. No one else has come forward. There's no sign of foul play." "No," she replied, her voice steady but laden with unease. "This isn't the end. The story isn't over. It never was." With a determined look, Miss Marple gathered her coat and adjusted her glasses. "We must go back, to the estate." "Back?" the officer asked, confused. "But the case is not over," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "There's more to this. The mastermind we've been searching for. He hasn't been found yet. Someone is playing us, someone who has been hiding in plain sight all along. But we've missed the most critical piece. They made their way to the family estate in silence, the night stretching on." Miss Marple's mind whirred as she considered the letter, each word carrying an ominous weight. There was a connection, something she had overlooked in the flurry of their previous conclusions, a witness, a lie, a final act. As they reached the Grand Manor, Miss Marple's eyes darted to the darkened windows, feeling an eerie sense of foreboding. The case had taken a turn, and now the true villain, whoever they were, was still hidden in the shadows. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they hadn't yet been put together. The door creaked open, and Miss Marple stepped inside, her heart racing with anticipation. She didn't know what would unfold in the coming hours, but one thing was certain. The mystery wasn't finished yet, and as she moved deeper into the house, a quiet realization settled within her. This was not just about Lady Evelyn, Lydia Calhoun, or even Lord Philip's family. It was about something much darker, something far-reaching. The final chapter had yet to be written. As she walked into the night, her thoughts turned once more to the cryptic message, "Do not trust the witness." A new mystery beckoned, and Miss Marple knew she was the only one who could untangle it. The game, it seemed, was far from over.